Okay, we are good.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight, our speaker is going to be remote from Philadelphia. We have a remote viewers online also. This is the first time for us to be able to do this, and it falls right into our wanting to reach as many people as we can with the topics that we're providing. So we appreciate your feedback on this format at the end of the program to see how we did. Okay. For those of you viewing remotely, your audio should be muted during the program. Everyone, please hold your questions until the end. And if you're viewing online, please type your questions in the chat box. So let me take a moment and introduce some people. The lady back there in the red sweater is Sarah Davis. She's our state archivist. This is Vicki Taylor. She's one of our reference archivists, and she's our videographer. IT guy tonight. Also, in the next week or so, a recording of this program will be uploaded to our YouTube channel if you wanted to view it again or tell other people about it. Okay. And then you can also view some of our previous programs there if you've missed them. Okay. So let me introduce our speaker this evening. I'm very excited about this because I'm reading this book. Brad Pearson is a former features editor of Southwest Magazine. He's written for multiple publications, which include the New York Times, the Esquire, Time, and Salon. He has a BA in International Relations from St. Joseph's University and was the 2014 recipient of the German Marshall Fund of the United States Marshall Memorial Fellowship. That's a mouthful. Which took him to Europe to study media on the continent. He grew up in Hyde Park, New York, and now lives in Philadelphia with his family. He became interested in Heart Mountain, its football team, while visiting Wyoming for a magazine story several years ago. The Eagles of Heart Mountain is his first book. I'm going to turn it over to Brad. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for having me tonight. It's an honor to be in Wyoming, even remotely. I miss being in the state. My research for this book took me to Wyoming a lot in previous years, but the last couple of years I have not been able to go because of, well, everything. So I appreciate being there even remotely. And thanks to the State Archives for having me tonight. I'm going to chat a little bit about sort of the history of the book that I wrote, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. Let me pull this up right now, and then in the middle of it, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the research that I did for the book. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm not sure what everyone at the archives would like to do from a question standpoint. But, like I said, I'm just so honored to be here tonight because I miss being in Wyoming. I've done the drive from Casper up to Cody a bunch of times for research for the book. And I know that's just a small section of your state, but I just really appreciate being here tonight. So thank you so much. Okay. Again, thank you again. A lot of the images that you're going to see in this presentation tonight are not included in the book, and I'll try my best to not give too much away from the book. So if you haven't read the book yet, hopefully this is sort of whets your appetite, and if you have read it, it'll give you some additional insight as to the book itself. So I usually start my presentations. Most of the time, I'm not presenting to folks in Wyoming, but I always start here at the place where it all began, which is Heart Mountain itself. So 48 million years ago in southern Montana, a 500 square mile chunk of dolomite and limestone broke free from the earth and traveled at 100 miles an hour until it stopped 25 miles later at its final resting place here in Northwest Wyoming. It's the largest surface landslide in the history of our planet, and scientists are still trying to sort of figure out how exactly it happened. And the reason that they're still trying to figure this out is that geologists a few decades ago realized that the top of Heart Mountain is newer than the bottom of, or excuse me, is older than the top of Heart Mountain, which would sort of explain the surface landslide. And what they figure out happened is that there's sort of a consensus is that some sort of volcanic or steam explosion occurred. And then some sort of gas, almost like a hoverboard, carried this mountain to its final resting place. And then for hundreds of millions of years, the land sat uninhabited. And native tribes passed through, as did fur trappers. But as a lot of you are familiar, the winters and the mountain lions sort of drove away any permanent residents on this part of Wyoming. In that part of Wyoming, it gets down to -30 in the winter, and it's one of the hottest parts of the state in the summer. Eventually, small towns of Cody and Powell eventually popped up in the Bighorn Basin, but those were the folks who were the only permanent residents of Northwest Wyoming in those sections until the U.S. government decided to remove 120,000 people of Japanese descent from the West Coast. And, you know, I always try to talk about this a little bit in my presentations, in that the event that we think of, Pearl Harbor, was just sort of the final step in this decades-long fight to remove Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And this image here, what you see is a group of Californians who are known as the Native Sons of the Golden West. And this group was founded in the 1800s to sort of honor the people in California who they saw as the folks who were the true Californians. And if you look at this group, they think of themselves as the people who really founded California, the people who are the real basis and the backbone of California. And if you look at this, you'd see no Mexican faces, you see no Chinese faces, you see no Japanese faces. And it's these sort of groups like the groups of the Native Sons of the Golden West and the American Legion, were sort of staunch advocates for the removal of Japanese Americans decades before Pearl Harbor. They teamed up with ranchers and politicians of every party to pass racist land laws, immigration quotas, and housing discrimination. And the reason for this, which I get into a little bit in the book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain, is farming, which when I first started working on this book, I didn't think would have as much of a sort of part in the book about football and Japanese Americans as it ended up having. But Japanese farmers in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century, really began to dominate farming on the West Coast. They came to the United States as laborers, but eventually grew into kings in some corners of the agricultural market. For instance, by 1910, Japanese farmers produced nearly 70% of the state of California's strawberries. By 1941, in Los Angeles County alone, Japanese American farmers controlled every planted acre of peas, beets, broccoli, celery, and cauliflower, and controlled 2 out of every 3 acres of vegetable farms in the county. So once Pearl Harbor happens in Hawaii, all these groups, so groups like the Native Sons, the American Legion, and all these farmers and ranchers who had felt threatened by the growth of Japanese American life in the United States and dominance by Japanese Americans, especially in the agricultural field, sort of snapped together. And they saw the war as a way to sort of put into motion the plan that they had really hoped to do for the past 4 decades, which was to try to remove Japanese and Japanese American life from the West Coast. And these ideas eventually sort of trickled their way up to the War Department at the United States. And 2 men in particular, 2 men named Carl Benditson and John DeWitt, sort of took it upon themselves at the War Department to really find a way to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And these 2 men, who had never met before World War II had started, sort of saw in themselves an ideology that they agreed with. And that ideology was essentially racism. And they built this idea that we needed to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast for, quote, military necessity. When in fact, the reason that they decided to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast had nothing to do with military necessity. It had everything to do with these decades and decades of racism and agricultural dominance by Japanese Americans. In the Eagles of Heart Mountain, my book, I talk a bit about these ranchers who had testified before the California State Assembly and came to them hat in hand and said, we can't go on with Japanese dominance of these fields. Whereas decades before, 10, 12 years before, these white ranchers had been more than welcome, or more than willing to pay Japanese immigrants pennies on the dollar to work these fields. But once Japanese immigrants arrived on the West Coast and saw all of the opportunities here from an agricultural standpoint, they really came to dominate that. So Benditson and DeWitt, these two men, once again, who had never met before, came up with this plan to sort of allocate and sort of abdicate the responsibility of military necessity to all of these different military commanders around the country. And they sold this idea to Franklin Roosevelt, who was so consumed by war in Europe that he, once again, abdicated his responsibility and essentially told all of his underlings at the War Department and the Department of Justice to just sort of get things done and get it done in a way that makes it as sort of palatable as possible. And this leads, unfortunately, to the creation of the Heart Mountain Relocation Center, which was sort of a euphemistic way to say a concentration camp in Northwest Wyoming. 11,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese residents who had been barred from citizenship by federal law moved to this piece of Northwest Wyoming, lived in barracks that had been built in less than an hour each. Most came from Los Angeles and were sent to one of the most inhospitable parts. If any of you have been to the part of your state, and I suppose all of Wyoming in general, is not the most hospitable place to move to in the winter or in the summer if you've spent most of your life in the temperate climates of Los Angeles. And immediately, as soon as the camp opened, it became the third largest city in the state of Wyoming. Once the Japanese Americans had been sent to Heart Mountain, they were stripped of everything. Everyone was allowed to bring pretty much as they could carry in their armful, and Japanese music, reading materials, anything in Japanese language was strictly prohibited on the trip to Wyoming. And these folks, as I mentioned earlier, were likely the first people in human history to have spent any sort of extended amount of time on this piece of land because it was so inhospitable. Like I said before, native tribes had passed it over, fur trappers, and there's a reason that this part of Wyoming, for the most part, is still pretty uninhabited, and that's that anyone who moved from the East Coast to the West Coast that came through Wyoming, especially this section of Wyoming, kept moving. And one of the first things that these industrious Japanese Americans did when they got to this camp, after they saw all the barracks there and they realized that they needed to do something, anything, to give especially the young people at the camp some semblance of their life again, some semblance of the life that they had been stripped from in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle and sent to Wyoming for no reason other than their race and no reason other than, in most of their cases, the country that their parents or their grandparents had come from. One of the very first things that they ever did was these Japanese Americans took it upon themselves, without the authority or without the financial backing of the federal government, was they cleared all the sagebrush and built a baseball field. Mm-hmm. And soon after that, the second thing they did was they built a football field. And those two things at Heart Mountain were incredibly important in the story that I tell in the Eagles of Heart Mountain. Whenever any of you who have read this book, or any of you who have seen the cover, recognize this photo. And I always include this photo in presentations that I give because I feel like what it does is it really shows just how difficult it must have been to be a young child, a child taken from your home, again, in Los Angeles or San Francisco, a city, and taken from anything you know and sent to this essentially barren strip of American soil and sent there. And if you look at this image was taken very early on after Japanese Americans arrived at Heart Mountain in August and September of 1942. If you see, all the barracks just have tar paper. Their roofs are barely tarred. And I think about these two young boys a lot, and I think about what it must have been like for them to come from whatever community they came from on the West Coast and to be sent to a place like this by their own government. Like, these were two American citizens sent to this piece of land due to no military necessity. Roosevelt, Benditson, and DeWitt completely ignored all of the naval, FBI, and War Department intelligence reports, which basically indicated that Japanese Americans and any Japanese citizen in the United States after Pearl Harbor would either be loyal to the United States as American citizens or would not cause any treason or espionage. And that ended up coming true. By the end of the war, there had been no Japanese American citizen who was ever convicted of any crimes against the United States, which is not the same that could be said for German or Italian citizens at the same time. This is a picture of Heart Mountain at night, which I think just shows sort of the vastness of this camp. So 11,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese nationals are sent to this camp. And you look at this and it just shows, I'm not telling anyone from Wyoming anything they don't know, but, driving through Wyoming at night can be a really lonely and isolating experience. And I think about, whenever I look at this photo, I think about the folks who were sent from their cities and from their homes and from their families to this place that none of them have ever been before. None of them knew anything about, and just thinking about what it must have been like on that very first night. You arrive on a train ride, a 3 or 4 day train ride from California, and you end up here under the sky that, we all look at now when we're in Wyoming as this magnificent night sky. But just thinking about being under that for that first night, 1,000 miles from your home and wondering why your country had forsaken you in that way. A little bit of a lighter note after that. These are the Heart Mountain Eagles, which is a football team that was founded in the summer of 1943 by a group of some white employees at Heart Mountain and also Japanese Americans. And I thought I would take this opportunity to sort of introduce this team, who are sort of the crux of the book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. I want to sort of use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about my research and the work that I put into this book to tell the story of these teenagers and these young men, and how I became so sort of enamored by them and obsessed about them to the point that I wrote a 400-page book about these young men. And the main characters in my book are 3 young men. One's named Babe Nomura, who you see on the far right side in sort of a dark hoodie. Another man named George Yoshinaga, a man named Kichi Ikeda, and I guess a 4th young man named Stanigawa. And I came to the story of the Heart Mountain Eagles in sort of a serendipitous way, in that in 2013, I was in Wyoming working on a totally separate story. I was working on a magazine story about Yellowstone. And while I was there, I was with another group of reporters, and someone who was leading the tour asked if any of us would be interested in visiting the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, which sits 11 miles east of downtown Cody. And I said, yeah, sure. I'd be interested in attending that and going and learning a little bit more about this. And I walked into the museum feeling, fairly cocky in my understanding of Japanese American, excuse me, at that point, I called it Japanese internment. And later on in my book, when I start doing the research, and maybe I'll get into this a little bit later, I call it Japanese American incarceration. And so I'm there and I walk in, like I said, a little bit cocky about my knowledge in this topic. I grew up in Hyde Park, New York, as the great moderator said at the beginning. And, so I felt like, as someone who grew up in the hometown of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I understood this history, and I studied history in high school and college. And I thought, oh, I get this. And I walked out of the museum pretty thoroughly embarrassed by how little I knew about the history of Japanese American incarceration. And part of that was that while I was reading all these various displays at this incredible museum, I read there were 3 sentences about this football team, the Heart Mountain Eagles. And if I read the 3 sentences right now, they would give away the end of the book, so I won't read them for anyone who hasn't read it. But basically, these 3 sentences on this one display about Heart Mountain said how incredible this team was, and how they were sort of this force at Heart Mountain, the camp that people look to, that these 11,000 people at this camp, up to 13,000 people at its peak, looked at these 40 kids as a sign of hope and a sign of sort of resilience in the face of the fact that they had been sent to this camp. And I went home. At the time, I lived in Dallas, and I went home and I wrote the story about Wyoming, and I wrote the story about Yellowstone. And at the same time, I could not, for the life of me, get this idea of the Heart Mountain Eagles out of my head. So I started pulling at some threads, and 6 months would pass or a year would pass, and I would think, I need to learn a little bit more about this team. And I need to learn more about these young men who are on this team. And I reached out to the folks who run the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. And I said, hey, do you guys know anything more about this football team? And the folks at the museum and the foundation there said, no, we don't really know much more about them, but we do have we have all the access to all of these various all these newspapers that were printed at Heart Mountain. And there was a newspaper there called the Heart Mountain Sentinel. And we have one guy who has digital copies of all of these. So email this guy whose name is Bacon Sakatani, and maybe you can get in touch with him, and maybe he'll send you these newspapers. So I get in touch with this man, Bacon, who at this point was in his early 80s. And I say, you don't know me. You don't have to respond to this. You know nothing about me, but I'm interested in learning more about this football team. Could you send me this? And within the week, I had a package with a CD on it. And there's a CD full of every single digital copy of the Heart Mountain Sentinel, which was the weekly newspaper printed at the camp. And at this point, I had a day job. I was the editor of Southwest Airlines in-flight magazine. So every night I would come home after my day job, and I would sit there and I would read through these newspapers, and I would find these stories of these young men of this football team. And I was really lucky in that the Heart Mountain Sentinel, this newspaper, was run by a man who used to work, was a newspaper man from Seattle. So he knew how to put together a newspaper. And more importantly, he knew what his readers wanted. And that was that they wanted to learn more and more about this football team, who was getting better and better with every game. So the newspaper slowly started to build out this sports section, where I was able to eventually, after every game was played that these young men would play, they would play games against local high schools from Wyoming. So they would play Lovell, and they would play Casper, and they would play games against scrimmages against Cody, and they would play from Red Lodge, Montana. So they would play all of these different Warlands. They would play all these different communities in Northwest Wyoming, and then games against Casper and from sort of in Yellowstone country in Montana. And I started to sort of build out this idea as to who I thought this team was and who these players were. and I would read game stories, and I would read columns, and I would read capsules and box scores as to how this team very quickly became sort of this dominant force in Northwest Wyoming. And I'll get into a little bit more about the success of the Eagles after I tell you a little bit more about my research. And that eventually I realized, okay, I have a lot of interesting information about this. I need to start finding and figuring out if any of these players are alive, or if any of these players' families are alive. So the first person I reached out to was, after doing all my research, I realized this young man, Babe Namora, who you see on the screen in sort of the dark hooded sweatshirt, was by far the best player at Heart Mountain. He was a young man who was a starting running back at Hollywood High School in Los Angeles before he was sent to camp. And he was really the linchpin of this team. And I found that Babe had unfortunately passed away about 10 years before I started working on the book. But I found his daughter, and I found, any reporter knows that when you find an obituary for someone that you're hoping to talk to, your first instinct is to scroll all the way to the bottom of the obituary and find any surviving family members. And I was really lucky in that I came across a woman named Jan Maury, who was Babe's daughter, and really led to this entire book being written. And I found Jan, and I asked her, I said, you don't know me from Adam, but would you be interested in talking to me a little bit about your dad? At that point, I wasn't sure if it was going to be a book or a magazine story, but I knew that I needed to tell this story of these young men. And, serendipity struck again, and Jan agreed to talk with me. And then that really opened everything up. Once I talked to Jan, she reached out to other family members and reached out to lots of other people in the Heart Mountain community, and really said to me, and really sort of gave me a bit of a pass into the Japanese American community. I am not Japanese American. I'm sort of a mutt of a white American, as many of us, especially on the East Coast, are. And she really helped me find sources, find resources, find people to interview. And that really set me on the path to be able to really work on this book. And, once I started doing interviews with the folks on the team, and I really started digging in, and that was when I started digging into the archives. So the Wyoming State Archives, National Archives, the archives at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, archives at the Japanese American National Museum, archives at UCLA, Cal Berkeley, the University of Wyoming, the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming, Washington State. I spent a lot of time in very musty basements and back rooms at the Carbon County Historical Society, or the basement of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I know this is a talk with the Wyoming State Archives, so I really want to extend my thanks and gratitude to all of the archivists at the Wyoming State Archives and archives around the country, because this book and so many books like it would not be possible without the archives themselves, the work of the archivists, and especially in my case, the digitization of these works. I know for a fact that I would not have been able to afford, even with my book advance, I would not have been able to afford to travel to UCLA, Washington State, the University of Hawaii, the Federal Reserve in St. Louis, whose archives included some of the financial records, for some reason, of Japanese Americans during the incarceration period, the University of Houston, all of these different groups, because of their digitization efforts, really help people like me, journalists and historians, be able to tell the stories of the United States and be able to tell these stories that I hope people can learn from. Because otherwise, without the work of archivists and historians and teachers and librarians, all of this stuff that happened in America's past is just going to sit on the shelf, or it's just going to go completely unlearned about. So I really just want to thank everyone as many times as I can because of that. And now I'll turn back to the fun stuff, which is football. As you can see in some of these photos, the one before and this one here, a lot of these photos have sort of the Heart Mountain Eagles football team are signed. And the reason that is because a lot of my imagery of the team itself comes from the Heart Mountain yearbooks. And that's because of the archives at Heart Mountain. And I was able to sort of work through some of these old Heart Mountain High School yearbooks and see and sort of build out who these young men were, not just through the photos, but also through, I was able to, especially with Babe Namora and some of the other players, I was able to actually look through, we've all been in high school. And I think that sort of the universal story of these young men, the universality is a lot of it is based on the fact that we've all been through high school before. And so a lot of the sort of the color that I got about these young men and about who their lives were beyond the football field was from these yearbooks. So whether it was going through senior class superlatives or looking at who signed their yearbooks and seeing the sort of the funny messages that were left for them, all of this sort of things that we don't think about in our daily lives that even within our homes sort of serve as this archive as to who we are, photos and different funny things that our friends have written about us, little keepsakes and notes and things that we've sort of collected about our own lives. I was able to sort of reassemble some of these young men's teenage lives while they were at Heart Mountain. Sort of taking a step back and teaching, learning a little bit about the team itself. The Heart Mountain Eagles was a group of young men who, because of the way the camp was set up, played games against white high schools from across Wyoming. But because of the way that the camp was also set up, they weren't allowed to ever leave any of their games. So every high school, whether it was Warland or Lovell or Red Lodge or Natrona County, had to come into the Heart Mountain camp to play. And these young men, only 3 of the players of the Heart Mountain Eagles had ever played high school football before in their lives. So when the call went out from the athletic department at the high school that they're going to start a football team, basically all of the captains, so Babe Namora and George Yoshinaga, started finding all of their friends at the camp who were athletes. So they started finding shortstops and they started finding pole vaulters and they started finding point guards on the basketball team. Anybody who sort of had this athleticism about them that they thought that they could be able to teach football in a really quick way. And because the Eagles played all of their games at the Heart Mountain camp, they quickly became the biggest draw in camp. So this field that they played on was a dirt field with stones, and they would only, there was no grass on the field. And so these games would quickly draw 4,000 or 5,000 fans. Close to a third or half the people at the entire camp would come and watch these games. And that was a testament not only to the fact that the Eagles were winning, but a testament to the fact that the Eagles, in a lot of ways, were serving as the only entertainment for folks at the camp. If you look at some of these images here, you can really see these games were played with 4, 6, 8 fans deep along the sidelines, just sort of showing what this team meant to the camp. These 3 young men I mentioned at the beginning. In the upper left is Babe Namora, who is sort of the starting running back. The young man holding the ball in the middle is George Yoshinaga, who was one of the 2 of the 3 other players who had played football before. And the young man on the upper right is a young man named Kichi Ikeda, who in the second season that the Eagles played, eventually became the starting quarterback. So I love including some of these images here that you can see about the Eagles playing. And these are all taken from the Heart Mountain High School yearbooks. I especially like this photo here underneath the Gunga Teramoda headline, because you just see how frankly stunned this player is that the Eagles are playing so well against them. Number 37 here. I'm not sure if we have any old Wyoming football fans in the audience, but this young man was a man by the name of Leroy Pierce, who played for Natrona County and was for 3 years running basically the All-State Player of the Year. And the last game that the Eagles ever played was against the Casper Natrona Mustangs, who are continuously and to this day remain one of the best football teams in the state of Wyoming. And they came in and played the Eagles. I love this photo because not only does it show sort of how outsized the Eagles were, it also shows sort of what they were up against. These young men, if you look at the plants, especially on the player on the right, they had no money for pads. So they had shoulder pads, but they couldn't afford thigh pads. So all of the players on the Heart Mountain Eagles would take sort of regular pants, stuff them with cardboard, and just hope to tape it into place in a way that protected them from the hits that were about to come. The reason that the Heart Mountain Eagles were so successful against all the other high schools was that they took their disadvantage in that to that point in American history, Japanese Americans were still much smaller than their white American counterparts. And that was because they'd only been in the United States for, a few decades at that point. Most of them still had a very low protein diet in terms of a very vegetarian diet, very little dairy. And they created essentially this offensive system that took their, I guess you could say, sort of their disadvantages and turned them into advantages. So when you're smaller than your opponents, what are you also? You're probably in most cases a little swifter. You're probably a little bit faster. So they created an offensive system that relied a lot on speed, deception, and being able to sort of bust through other teams' offensive and defensive lines to be able to either sack the quarterback, block punts, or to get through the line and to be able to run sort of an offensive scheme that was very fast and kept the ball moving a lot. This image that I have on the screen right now is Babe Nomura's varsity letter. And when Jan Mori, Babe Nomura's daughter, agreed to speak with me for this book, she invited me out to her house in Anaheim, in Orange County, Orange County, California, excuse me. And she let me work through and sort of sit through her family's archives and everything that her dad and her mom had collected from Heart Mountain. And I specifically remember sitting in her guest bedroom, going through this family archive, these family heirlooms, and turning to this page in a binder that had her dad, Babe Nomura's varsity letter. And at that point in my research, I didn't know as much about the football team as I do now. But this really stood out to me as one of those moments in my research where you sort of stop in your tracks and you think about all of the history and everything that came into this varsity letter. And in hindsight, I realized through my research that the federal government and the War Relocation Authority was not paying for these sort of items for the football team. These items were being paid for by the Japanese Americans and the Japanese nationals that had been incarcerated at the camp. So they were scraping together whatever money they had to buy varsity letters for the football teams and basketball teams and baseball teams at the camp to give these young men, to give these 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old young men some semblance and some resemblance of their previous lives, what their lives would have been like if they had been playing football in 1943 in Seattle or in Hollywood or in Mountain View, California. And holding this piece of, history in my hands really solidified in my mind just how important this story was to tell, for not only a Japanese American audience, but for an American audience. And in those moments, I realized that I had a real opportunity to tell a story that reached a broader audience, beyond most stories about the Japanese American incarceration experience. As a white reporter and as a white journalist, I knew that if I told this story in a way I could appeal, unfortunately, because I was from outside the Japanese American community, I knew that I had an audience that could also learn about this history that I woefully and sort of embarrassingly knew so little about. These young men, at the same time that these young men at Heart Mountain were dominating on the football field, the federal government was doing a sort of secondarily unconscionable thing in my mind, which was that they started drafting young Japanese American men out of the camps and sending them to the front lines in Italy and France. They basically told these young men, you're not American enough to live free in the United States, the country of your birth, but you are American enough to die in northern Italy and southern France for the country that has incarcerated you. And these young men became known as the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, and they resisted the draft, and they were incarcerated and convicted and incarcerated for their stand against joining the Army. And a lot of Heart Mountain folks who were incarcerated at Heart Mountain and Tule Lake and Manzanar and Minidoka and Gila River and all these other places fought valiantly in World War II, and I think that their honor and sacrifice should be respected and commemorated. But I also think that these young men who are being asked to fight for a country that didn't think enough of them as Americans to let them live in their own homes in Los Angeles or up and down the West Coast. I thought that telling this story within the context of the Heart Mountain Eagles was equally important, because I talked at the top a little bit sort of the universality of this story. And as a young man, as someone who has been a teenage boy, thinking about being an athlete and then at the same time being asked whether you're loyal enough by your federal government to not loyal enough to live free, but loyal enough to fight for the United States, and having the courage of conviction to sort of say, I'm going to stand up and say, yes, I will gladly fight for the United States as long as you close this camp, as long as you let my family free. I don't know what I would have done in that situation. I don't know what most of my friends would have done in that situation. I think that telling that part of the story, which was not something that I initially set out to do, seemed an important counterbalance to the football and the war story that I was telling throughout the rest of the book. And I think that these young men's conviction really held true, and that after the war was over and they were eventually let out of prison, many of them went back and fought in the Korean War. And I was going through some oral histories and some archives about one of the Heart Mountain Eagles who was eventually one of the draft resistors who did sign up and was sent to Korea. And somebody who was running the oral history asked, why would you have done that? And he essentially said, why wouldn't I? I was a loyal American. Just my country had put me in an untenable position, and a position that made me choose between myself, my family, my heritage, and my country. And that put me in a sort of between many, many rocks and many hard places, which is something that I thought about a lot when I was writing the book. And this is the last image that I'll show, and then I'll take some questions if anybody has anything. But this image is one of the sort of indelible images in my mind of the Heart Mountain camp. And the reason that is, and the reason that this image sat on my desk every day when I was writing this book, was that if you put your thumb over any of these faces of these young men and women at the Heart Mountain camp, they would have looked exactly like any other young man or woman in the United States at that point. They have the pegged pants, they have the varsity cardigan, they have the pompadoured hair, poodle skirts, they have the high white socks. These are just American teenagers. And these young Americans were sent to this camp against their will, purely only because of the heritage of their ancestors. And so whenever I was writing this book, I thought about these teenagers, none of which are any of the teens that I actually write about. But I look at this picture, and I would look at this picture a lot, because I feel like it really centered me and grounded me into anger. Might be too strong of a word, but probably not. Into my anger that I felt writing this book about how unnecessary this period of American history was. With that, I thank you so much for your time. And if anyone has any questions or anything about my research or the history of Japanese American life, I'd be more than happy to chat with you about that. I think someone is trying to speak, but I think they're muted.
Just a thing. I think, Susan, are you trying to ask a question? I think you're on mute if you are.
Oh, okay. All right.
I can hear you.
I was just gonna say my dad was in Heart Mountain and my grandparents. And he was younger than the football players. He was 13 when he arrived. But he, being in Heart Mountain really shaped his life. He was in the Boy Scouts, and a lot of the things that he learned just about being there and surviving, it really, really shaped him for his whole life and passed it on to me and my brothers. And my mom is still here. She's her family was in Tule Lake.
Right.
But there's not too many of the Nisei remaining, as you know.
Yeah.
But I've been to Heart Mountain. I took my dad when they had the grand opening in 2011.
Okay.
And I was hoping to be able to take him again, but that didn't happen. But anyway, it was really interesting, and a lot has been added there since I've been there. My daughter was able to go, I think 3 years ago. It was before COVID, because she had to go on a business trip in Idaho. So she added on some vacation time, and she met with Dakota, and they were looking for some pictures of restoring the root cellar, like those little vents for the root cellars. And I found some photos that we had taken because my dad took us there. I was only 5 years old, so I don't remember a lot of it. But I found some original pictures because they were trying to restore them to what they looked like originally. But I'd really like to go back there again. And I was wondering, like, how long did it take you to do all the research and put the book together? It sounds like a long time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all of your family history. Like you said, the thing is, this Nisei generation, which for folks who don't know, the Nisei generation was the first generation of Japanese Americans, and that generation is, like in your family, unfortunately, they're getting older. And for me, finding Nisei folks to speak with about this book was difficult, but the folks that I did, I was able to interview one living Heart Mountain Eagle, Kichi Ikeda, who unfortunately passed away about 2 months ago now. But then I was able to interview a lot of other folks who are probably closer to your dad's age, just that those couple years younger, that folks like that who had an idea of what was going on at camp and what this football team meant to those younger players.
Yeah.
I first, like I said, I first sort of came up with the idea when I was there in 2013, but I didn't really start working on the book in earnest until about 2000. It was honestly, I remember it was a little bit after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, because I thought to myself, like, oh, this is probably a story that has some unfortunate bearing in American history now. So in early 2017 is when I started sort of doing a lot more of the research. And then I guess it was 2017, late 2017 was when I first reached out to sort of some of the families. And then I actually went to the Heart Mountain pilgrimage. And for folks who don't know, a lot of the former Japanese American incarceration camps have an annual event where families and folks who are incarcerated at the camps go back. And the Heart Mountain pilgrimage especially is a really, really robust, large event, which brings lots of different families together. And that was sort of, for me, was an opportunity to go. And I'd already talked to Jan Mori, Babe Nomura's daughter, at that point. And that was the first opportunity for me to sort of introduce myself to the
Mhm.
broader Japanese American and Heart Mountain community and
Mhm.
sort of let them know that this is something that I took very seriously. And this was something that I didn't want to just sort of drop in and drop out and
Mhm.
do this story, because I knew, as someone who wasn't a member of this Japanese American community, that I needed to work really hard to gain the trust of the community and the Heart Mountain community,
Mhm.
not just personally, but I knew that it would make the book better. And I knew that it would,
Mhm.
if I
Right.
knew everything I could about this community and I became vested in them and their families and this history, that I knew I needed to do that, not only to
Mhm.
make the book good, but morally, ethically, and personally, I was not going to do this project
Mhm.
if I couldn't tell myself that I had done
Mhm.
everything I could to make it as good as possible.
Right.
So for me, that meant spending a lot of time at Heart Mountain with families. It's been
Mm.
spending a lot of time in LA with families. It's spent
Mhm.
spending a lot of time on the phone with families who were in Hawaii and San Francisco, and a lot of
Mhm.
time where it made the book better, but I also
Mhm.
knew that it made these families trust me, and it made them,
Mhm.
this is somebody who I can trust with my family's story.
Mhm.
So that was started in about 2017. And then I turned my first draft of the book in December of 2019.
Okay.
So sort of got in right under the wire before COVID hit
Mhm.
everybody. So I was really lucky in that I was able to get all of my research and
Mm.
most of my writing done before that.
Oh,
And
that's
then
good.
sort of went through edits, and then the book
Mm.
first came out. It's sort of ironic that the very first January 6th hearings are happening as I'm talking
Right.
now,
Yeah.
because the book came out January 5th, the day before
Mm.
sort of the insurrection on the Capitol. So I
Yeah.
feel like this event in particular is sort of a strange bookend on the beginning of
Yeah.
my book
Mhm.
cycle and today. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I just ordered a copy while you were doing your
oh,
presentation.
great. Thank you so much. I
Um,
really
but
appreciate it.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
It's
my
also for
dad's got
anyone
a,
else. It's available at a lot of libraries around the state
yeah.
too. So
Mm. Well, this is something I'd want to keep. So for
thank you.
sure. Um, but my dad, he's got a short autobiography that one of his bucket list things to do was like to teach future generations what happened so that doesn't happen again. And
Yeah.
my daughter was in high school when he was actually supposed to, had our American history class and he was supposed to speak. I made helped him make a presentation for
Mhm.
that. And he was supposed to speak to her class, but like the day before he had a stroke. So
Oh
he
gosh.
was never able to reschedule it because it was like the end of the year and just
Sure.
they ran out of time to be able to squeeze it in. So,
Yeah.
but
Well, for
um,
me, and I said this when I was writing the book, and that when the book came out, I would have been happy and proud of what I did if the Japanese American community said, "You've done a good job and you've honored our community." And what I've attempted to do since the book came out is use my platform as a journalist and author to
mm,
teach this history. And, so I visit classrooms, I visit AP US history classrooms, and I do stuff
oh, that's
on
great.
Zoom, and I've never turned down a single opportunity to speak about this. And for me at this point, you know, because of the way that book contracts are structured, I've been paid for this book. I worked, a couple years on this book. So for
Mm,
me, what this book means to me now is exactly what you said your father said. And that
mm,
is teaching this history to groups, whether it's young folks, old
mm,
folks, whoever it is, Americans, Europeans,
right.
Japanese, whoever it is to teach this history and to let folks know about it in a 20-minute presentation, an hour, a whole day,
Mm,
whatever that is.
yeah.
Because I think that now is my most important role with
Yeah.
this,
He
is
did
that,
a few presentations at various, probably maybe a half
yeah.
a dozen schools or so.
And I mean, that's the kind of thing that is so important for
Mm,
kids to learn about. And, I can only tell so much, but coming from a Japanese American voice and a Nisei
Yeah.
voice and someone who lived this,
Yeah.
that's 1,000 times more impactful than anything that even
Mhm.
I could do. So
Thank you so much,
Right.
Susan, for
Yeah.
your memories and questions. We are so glad that you are here.
Oh, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss it,
thank
but
you.
I've got like tons of photos. We even have, my grandpa had some journals that he wrote. They're in Japanese, so they aren't all translated, but like daily journals he wrote from when he was in Heart Mountain.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So, but there's a book and there's some excerpts from it that were translated. We're in Michigan.
Okay.
They came east because of all the whatever discrimination on the West Coast. They didn't want to go back to California, but there's a book called Exile to Motown that's about a lot of the Japanese Americans that came to Michigan. And there's a chapter with my dad, and there's some excerpts from my grandpa's journals that were translated. So that was really, to come from an Issei, like
that's very rare. Yeah.
Is really interesting. And I hope we can someday translate more of that and maybe share it with the Heart Mountain people. And
that'd be great. They would love it. Yeah. They're always looking for other stuff to sort of share that story. So
yeah, especially Issei. Like even now it's hard to get an Issei, but Issei would be probably really valuable to what what their thought processes were about things that happened and things like that. So
sure.
Well, Brad, I think we've got a couple questions here on
Skype. Great.
Have a moment.
I'm going to turn my speaker off.
How we can do this.
Okay.
If you want to come a little closer, I think Brad should be.
Talking to the
Yes. Talking to the box.
Talking to the box.
If any of you if you want to turn the camera back on that end, sometimes it helps me if I can't hear to be able to sort of
see my lips.
the room. So yeah, it helps a little bit. So
Well, tell you what.
but if you don't have the ability to, that's fine. I should be able to hear it fine. It's always just sort of a backup.
There we go.
Okay, can you see
All
me?
right. Yes.
All right, so I'm looking at the screen, so the camera's over here. So
I'm looking at your left ear. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's a pretty left ear.
Yeah, it is. I like it.
So I'm Dave Markham. I'm here in Cheyenne, and I'm listening to your discussion, and I'm trying to come to terms with how this third largest community in Wyoming actually operated. So listening to your discussion, I assume that at the camp they had a high school, they had an elementary school. Is that correct?
Yes.
You noted they have to do the pledge every day.
Yes, they did.
So they're incarcerated in this camp, and every day they're getting up and I pledge allegiance to this country. That basically,
There's a flagpole right in the middle of the camp, the
Okay.
American flagpole. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that they didn't have thigh pads,
Right.
but I know I love the helmets, the old leather helmets.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So who paid for the helmets and the shoulder pads? And
So-
that line that was used to put the lines on the field, and who paid for the goalposts, and who paid for the footballs, and all of that.
Yeah. So there were certain like recreation fees that the War Relocation Authority allotted to activities, but that only came about after a year after they were in camp. So the first year that everybody was in camp, there was basically no money. And the federal government was feeding them hot dogs, powdered milk, and there was nothing. And essentially what happened was that the Heart Mountain folks and folks at Manzanar, Tule Lake, and all these other camps essentially said, we're going to go nuts and we're going to start rioting if we don't start getting some more funds to make our lives a little bit better. And so the War Relocation Authority started putting a little bit more money into the camps, and it wasn't much. Then what they did was that they sort of started allotting it, and there were some weird things that they did in that the War Relocation Authority paid for some things, but then also charged Japanese Americans for other things. So eventually they opened 2 one-screen movie theaters in the camp. They would take people out of the barracks and put a movie theater in, and then charge them for tickets, and then use those ticket fees to pay for other things within the camp. But essentially what it came down to was that there was a guy who ran sort of let's call it the recreation department. And he started striking up deals and conversations with sporting goods stores from across the West. So in Billings and in Cheyenne and in Salt Lake City and in Denver. And he started working with these guys and saying, hey, if, this is who this is for, can we get X at cost? Can we get 50 baseballs? Can we get 17 helmets or whatever it is? And if you look a little bit closer in the book, that picture of them with the leather helmets and stuff and the uniforms are in there. And if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that some of the uniforms are different. A lot of the helmets are different. So they were sort of trying to piece together these things where they can grab 5 things at a time, grab 6 things at a time. The second season that the Eagles play, they eventually buy a set of tackling dummies. And those tackling dummies were paid for by a fundraiser that the student council at the high school put on. So a lot of it was, fundraisers that the Japanese American community were pooling their money towards, which at the time, this is kind of getting in the weeds, but every job at the camp, whether you were a physician, whether you worked in the mess hall, wherever it was, whether you were a teacher, the most money you could make was $16 a month. And that $16 was $1 less than the monthly salary for a U.S. Army private. And what they did was that the federal government decided that from a PR standpoint, they couldn't possibly sell to the American public that any of these Japanese Americans were making more than our brave boys on the front lines. So even the Japanese American doctors who were working at the Heart Mountain Hospital were making less than an Army private. So even with those meager wages, these folks were putting aside some of their money to pay for the recreation at Heart Mountain High School, which, a lot of these folks were still having to pay if they didn't have to sell their home when they left the West Coast. If they had somehow found someone to watch after their home for them, they were still having to pay the mortgages on their home while only making $12, $14, or $16 a month. So for them to take any of that money and to set it aside for this football team sort of shows just how much this team meant to the folks at the camp.
Were there cheerleaders? And before, and the reason I asked that is that's kind of my not so subtle way of asking, were there outlets for the young ladies?
Yeah. So there weren't cheerleaders, but there was a yell leader, which is this man named Dempsey Matsumoto, who was a yell leader with the big bullhorn.
Sure. And
from a research standpoint, one of the best things that I found in my research, and it's literally, that much copy in the whole book, is that I was at the National Archives in DC, and I was in the basement and I was going through the microfilm, and I had the microfilm reel on there, and I found this piece of paper that had been scanned in 1945 and added to the microfilm. That was a list of the chants and the cheers that this yell leader would have the crowd yell during the Eagles football games. And for me, that was the kind of thing that, even though it doesn't even take up a half a page in the book, added a lot of context to what this team meant and to what these teenagers outside of the team were trying to achieve and trying to have some semblance of their normal life. And as for the young women, there were actually women's sports. There was volleyball, softball, and a women's basketball team as well for high school players. And a lot of them, that was more intramural. They didn't necessarily play outside teams, but a lot of that was because there were very few women's sports at a high school level for any of the Wyoming high schools at that point too. So it was more of a intramural sports. But yes, they still had it. And Babe and George ended up coaching some of those sports as they grew older at the camp, coached some of the women's teams, which I thought was sort of an interesting wrinkle to their time at camp too.
So one last question. Did the men's baseball team have the same kind of schedule as the football team?
So for some reason, baseball didn't book as many outside games, but the internal league, so the league within Heart Mountain, baseball was the biggest sport internally. And the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, actually made an exemption that allowed all-star teams from the different camps, so from camps in Colorado and Arizona and Wyoming, to play all-star games against each other, provided that they could pay for the cost. So a team from Heart Mountain actually traveled down to Arizona to Gila River to play as sort of a morale boosting game. So the best players from Heart Mountain played the best players in Gila River. And then the next year it switched and the Gila River players came to Wyoming to play. And, baseball at that point was really sort of seen as the game in the Japanese American community. And that's because when Japanese immigrants arrived in the United States, baseball was popularized in the United States and Japan at the same time. So there was no learning curve. When Japanese Americans arrived in the United States, they already knew how to play baseball. It had already been a popular sport in Japan before Japanese Americans arrived in the United States. So baseball was sort of seen not necessarily as this American sport, but as sort of an equalizing sport, as something that Japanese immigrants, Japanese Americans could play on the same level as white Americans. So that was another outlet for the young men in camp as well.
Thanks, Brad. Robin's giving me the stink eye, so I'm leaving.
Thank you so much. It's a great questions.
Do you have any other questions here in the room?
Just one question, how many have gone to Heart Mountain? It's in this group.
Oh, we got about half of the group in here that's been to Heart Mountain.
It's different than what the pictures are showing.
Yeah.
It doesn't have near as much there to see, except for the museum, of course, but
Yeah. It's
You
I
get
I
really-
encourage anyone to go up. It's really a wonderful experience, a sobering experience, and the group at the Heart Mountain Foundation has really done a wonderful job, and they're continuing to expand the interpretive center. They continue to expand. As Susan pointed out, they've done a full renovation of the root cellar, which sort of commemorates and memorializes all of the agricultural work that the Japanese Americans did on the site, not only while the camp was open, but sort of the legacy of agriculture in Park County. A lot of that is driven by the work that Japanese Americans did during the war in terms of creating arable fields and irrigation systems and tapping into the Shoshone in a way that really made the landscape of Park County, when you drive through, if you drive up from Thermopolis or from Powell to Cody, and the things that you see in the fields and the way that those fields are developed now, so much of it is because of the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated there during the 1940s. So I really encourage anyone who hasn't been up there to go, and it's fun. Cody is a nice little town to spend a few days in. That's where I spent most of my hotel nights when I would go visit for the pilgrimage or any of my other reporting trips. So, and if anyone else has anything else, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is pretty easy to find at my website, which is bradfordpearson.com. And I'm always happy to chat with anyone about either their personal history with Heart Mountain, the state history of Wyoming with Heart Mountain, and anything else that you might be interested in. So
Thank you very much.
well, thank you all, and thank you to the archives for having me. As I was saying earlier, it's always an honor to talk anything about Japanese American incarceration, because I think it's a topic that is still unfortunately timely, and it's a history that more Americans need to know. So I thanks to the state archives for having me, and you guys have been great. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for coming. And remember, we have another program next month as part of our speaker series. It will also be a remote watch party like tonight. So it's nice that we're being able to do these for you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Brad. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you all so much. I appreciate it.
Okay,